And so next up, and the last keynote for this morning, we have Oliver Geden from, I need to check the name because I always get it wrong, the German Institute for International Security Affairs, SWP, and also at visiting at Max Planck Institute now. A few years ago, Oliver started publishing papers in this area, and the sort of reaction was a little bit different depending on who you spoke to. Some people were, who is this guy writing stuff about climate policy? And other people were saying, hey, did you see that commentary in Nature? This guy's got a point. And I think over time, many people have come to realise that Oliver has many good points to make on climate policy and interaction between science and policy. So I really look forward to your presentation in the next 30 minutes or so. Thank you, Oliver.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're going to talk about the integration of carbon dioxide removal into the European Union's climate policy. So what is happening in the everyday life of policymakers in the so-called real world, or in their real world. And I think when talking about policymaking, it's always about context. So we have to choose a case. In that case, it is the European Union, but I think many of the insights could be transferred at least to other OECD countries. So, could we see the EU as a potential global leader in CDR? I mean, policymakers informed by the IPCC seem to have acknowledged or accepted that CDR is necessary to meet the targets, like Detlef and Sabine just showed. But as we all know, they've avoided indicating who's exactly going to deliver it. So if you have 600, 700, 800 gigatons of gross CDR during the 21st century, it's simply not enough to say, well, yeah, we have to do that. The question is, who could do that? And the EU is still one of the largest emitters in the world, has a high degree of historical responsibility for climate change, and praises itself for climate leadership in the international arena, rightly so. So couldn't we expect them to do something about it? But at the same time, we see there's hardly any action on CDR so far, not even much talk. So together with Glenn, we looked at scenario results on regional distribution. They are not much, maybe they're not even that valid, but as you see at the right at the top, the EU lands at about 50 gigatons in the 21st century, would be less than 10% of total CDR, so we could say that's quite a fair share. So 50 gigatons is quite a lot if you emit 4.4 or 3 per year right now, so it's more than 10 years of today's annual emissions, and it's quite shocking if you talk to policymakers about that. For them it's quite shocking because they don't talk about, they don't think about it, and then they get such a number. So to understand why that is the case, why they are reluctant, and what might change, I propose to look at what I would call the climate change mitigation paradigm. We find public policy paradigms in every domain of policymaking. In one sentence, it's the shared cognitive model to facilitate problem solving. That's what policymakers instinctively go to if they say, okay, what do we have to do? Who's responsible? What's the problem? Who has caused it? What should be done about it? And by who exactly? So the objective is clear. It's like it's the UNFCCC objective, avoiding dangerous climate change by not crossing certain thresholds. The narrative, the core narrative of EU climate policies, emissions reductions in line with science and support for low carbon techs will facilitate global climate stabilization and simultaneously deliver green growth. And the green growth part, I think, is a major part of that climate policy narrative, or the climate policy mitigation narrative. Storyline, where we just had a couple of articles on that. It's 5 minutes to midnight, but we can still make it if we start to act now, and acting means mitigating here. But of course, it's not all about mitigation. Adaptation has been accepted as a second strand of mainstream climate policy. And geoengineering is looming as a possible future third option, and in a way, it's a problem for the debate on CDR, and I will come back to that later. So if we look how it comes together, if we want to deploy CDR in the European Union, it somehow has to fit into that core paradigm, or of course there could be paradigm shifts or even changes, but they are not easy to get. I would say that CDR is not a fundamental challenge to the core of the climate policy paradigm, but at least presents an irritation to the EU success story. Policymakers would ask, does accepting CDR mean admitting partial policy failure? We haven't talked about that yet. Now we have to do all that crazy stuff. And the IPCC tells us what has gone wrong, because they will treat it as a surprise. For many, it is in fact a surprise, although we have it in the assessments for quite some years now. If the EU were not to blame because we did just fine, but something else went wrong globally, why does the EU have to carry the global CDR burden, or at least some share of it, of course? What are the business opportunities here? What are other co-benefits? It's not obvious. I would say at least for engineered CDR, like BECCS or direct air capture, it might be different, or it will be different for so-called natural climate solutions, land-based CDR. So is CDR a rational imperative, or just convenient borrowing from the future? That's referring to the moral hazard debate. Is it a betrayal of EU climate actions? Some NGOs phrase it like that, or frame it like that. Or is it just an extension of the current approach? So CDR in the IPCC assessment, it's both mitigation and it's part of geoengineering. And to put it bluntly, if it's called geoengineering, the EU just can't do that, because we are the good guys, geoengineering is bad, that does not fit. So we will see changes in the framing, and one way just to say, okay, it's just a form of mitigation, you could call it enhanced mitigation, or Sabine used conventional mitigation, and it could be unconventional mitigation, whatever. But in order to be able to do that, and not being overly criticized, it has to be declared some form of mitigation, and I think there are good reasons to do that. A second part is that it will shift responsibilities and burdens. Right now, the zero line is the conceptual reference point. So it means if you are a pioneer in climate policy, you go to zero, to minus 100%, and then the others will have to follow. Your job is basically done at minus 100%, and laggards will follow. That happens globally. That happens in the EU, where the northwestern part is pioneering. Eastern and Central European countries are following reluctantly, and of course among sectors where power sector does the major part of the job right now, others are to follow. If you move into negative territory and say, well, it's at least possible or thinkable that some actors do minus 130, minus 140%, then you create a lot of room for maneuver, because then other actors can say, well, then why don't you just do 150, minus 150? Because we will never get to the 100. So in the global arena, you have that principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR, where developing countries and emerging economies say, well, historically, the OECD 1990 countries are to blame. And in order to get the balance right and straight, they would have to move much deeper into negative territory, while we, as India, well, we'll never go to zero, and we just don't have to. That can happen on every level, simply because you have these broader target ranges. Some other dimensions, of course, there's economic and political assessment of CDR. So what kind of incentives and regulation do we need, risks and side effects? Which companies want to deploy CDR actually, or have them deployed in order not having to mitigate conventionally, which fear unwelcome competition. If you talk to companies working in conventional mitigation and renewables, they don't really like the CDR discourse. How would they fit in this is a really important point. into existing and planned infrastructures, regulatory cultures, and mental models of national energy systems. So if you are at the beginning of a transition and have an idea, many countries in Europe, the European Commission as well, has come up with long-term plans until 2050. There will be a new plan on the EU level by the end of the year, the beginning of the next years. If you propose a new technology, people will ask, well, do we really want to do that in our country? How would fit BECCS into the German energy transition? And people very often would say, no, it just doesn't fit here. It does not poll well. The public might be skeptical about it. That's for policymakers who have more problems on their hands than they can solve, more proposed solutions than they can think about, but still have to make decisions all the time. That's a relevant factor. And of course, and that also, we all know that, but we as researchers often don't think about that. How would approaches fare on the electoral market in general or with relevant target groups? Of course, not only politicians think about that, but also people in ministries. And since CDR would change projected emissions trajectories of the EU, member states and economic sectors, all these actors would think about it. What is in it for me? And I think one major takeaway from here, and you now already know that I'm a social scientist, although I work at the Max Planck Institute right now, political costs are often more relevant than economic costs, and preferred solutions usually chase fitting problems. So we as researchers think, okay, here's the problem, now we derive solutions from that. A policymaker would look at a set of solutions and say, how would that work for me, with my constituency, with my allies? And they would assess technologies or approaches based on that. So here I just chose four, and in the EU that consists still of 28 member states, soon to be 27. It's not only on the EU level where decisions are made. There's always the framework decisions are made there, but member states are quite different in the political setup regarding topography, geography, political cultures. So looking at just these four, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, there are things you can do but not talk about, and vice versa. And that's a major insight of books I really like to refer to, written by Niels Brunson, a Swedish organizational theorist. In policymaking, there are things you can do if you don't try to defend them every day, it just works out. And there are things you can propose and have decisions on it, but you try to implement them, then you're running into resistance. And you could see that, and I will come back later to that, with bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. We do bioenergy a lot, but we don't talk about it. We have made many decisions on CCS, but we weren't able to do that. Direct air capture and storage, yeah, might be very expensive, but in countries like Germany, you could just try to sell, and I think successfully, direct air capture, if you don't overemphasize the storage part too much for now. As we could integrate that in a high variable renewables system and just treat it as a power to X technology, whereas the X is negative CO2 emissions. We could run these machines when we have excess renewable power. If that would work out economically, well, a policymaker would just not care about that right now, but it's an interesting idea how it could fit into the national energy policy storyline. Then afforestation, ecosystem restoration, soil carbon sequestration have been dubbed now natural climate solutions. That's a good way to sell it politically, and it's a good way to do these things anyway, but you see green parties, environmental movements like that. You might have heard that on the EU level, the parliament made a decision on net zero by 2050, net negative thereafter, and the rapporteurs in these committees were from the Green Party. It was somehow surprising to see them talking about net negative, but they were looking at that particular angle. Then if you look at industrial at the industrial system, carbon negative cement or steel, I would say that would fly under the political radar. It would be not really contested. If the engineers think they can do that, they should just do that. The industry is not at the core of the European energy and climate policy debate. Of course, they are concerned for the right reasons, but it's not at the core. So let's just look at biomass and CCS. So what you could see here, this is wood and other solid biofuels, that's biogas, that's liquids. So more than 60% of European renewables come from biomass. And not that many, even in the energy industry, know that. In Germany, it's the same. I couldn't show you an official German figure on that because our government just doesn't publish it. We have renewable energy statistics. They don't aggregate the numbers. They show it sector by sector, but in the same brochure, they never aggregate the numbers because more than half of the circle would be green in some sort. Here, they decided not to do it in green. It has a very bad reputation in the media, probably also among the public. But if you do it, you can just do it. If you would propose a deliberate strategy, bioenergy, it has to be more. You would probably run into resistance. And in some countries, we even forgot about the high share of it. So it's something you can do, but if you would talk about it and say, well, we have to do more, you would run into opposition. Opposite story is CCS. What you see here is the proposed demonstration program, the CCS demonstration ambition as decided in 2007 by the, I don't know, at that time 25 leaders of the European Union, 15 demonstration plans, a broad range of technologies. None of them emerged. And in the IMs we looked at in our paper, that would be, the green area would be the assumptions for CCS in the EU. We just assume, okay, maybe we would use it all for CCS. That's of course not true, but then it would be, might be even, it might deviate from that line. But here's the reference scenario of the European Commission about CCS in the European Union, and we all are not even sure if that's going to emerge. So you can talk about the need for CCS, and we do that in our community for quite some time. The industry does it, even some environmental ministries are doing it, but it's not emerging in practice. Of course, one of the problems is it's tightly connected to prolonging coal power station. In Germany, it would be specifically lignite. We don't have any idea how policymakers, how the public would look at CCS if it were clear it's for negative emissions only. We just don't know. If you're concerned about storage, then it doesn't make a difference. But we don't know what the situation would be in 20 years, hopefully, when it would be clear, okay, it's not about prolonging the lifetime of coal power. So the EU should, in my mind, certainly explore CDR, support for research, development and demonstration, eventually support for deployment, integration into policy and accounting frameworks. I mean, there is not even a debate yet. Detlef highlighted that when showing the title of the Nature Energy paper. We don't even have a basic political signal. Yes, we are going to do that. So I would think it's a bit premature to go in every details of regulation, how we would do that. I mean, we can talk about it. It's an interesting thought experiment. How could that fit into the existing legislation of the EU? But we are simply waiting for basic signal that the EU says, yes, that will be part of our future climate policy as well. Coming to the next point, and that's how it will be part of a global strategy, because the EU has to look for global allies. If we would say, okay, maybe 10% of the global CDR share, whatever it will be, the EU would have to deliver it. There are several ways to do that, but who are the others? Are there can there be coalitions? Are there other countries or states in the US? We can work it. So we should certainly explore it, but we should try to limit its conceptual use. So when we talk about risks and benefits of CDR, we think about deployment. But that's when technology-specific risk will materialize, mainly during deployment. I personally don't think we will ever reach the 600 to 800 globally or 50 gigatons in the EU. It will be somewhere between 0 and these numbers. It will be part of a larger portfolio, of a larger mitigation portfolio. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but we simply can't say where we will land. But the risk for the integrity of climate policy, they materialize already when integrating CDR into scenarios, not here in that case, not in global scenarios, but in scenarios for the European energy system or for the European climate policy. Of course, what could happen in a temporal dimension that we in Europe simply do the same that we have seen in IAM models. We just shift things a little. It would not be illegitimate as such. So we could flatten mitigation pathway. We could shift net zero years. We could assume but not plan for net negative in the long term. Right now, the European Union doesn't do that. It's minus 80 to minus 95% by 2050. They start talking about net zero around that date or later, but we could end up assuming CDR later in the century and then flattening out pathways before. On the national or regional level, we could see that Eastern European countries in the European Union might say, well, we are economically disadvantaged for our population, for our constituency. Climate policy does not play a major role. So if you, the Commission, as dominated by certain member states, want to go into that, you can do that. Germany, France, the UK, the Netherlands, the Nordic countries can do that. But we can also use that for balancing out obligations within the European Union, because it's not so easy for us. And it could, at least in the green growth front-runner storyline, be seen as okay, but if we are doing that and the others are never following and might be buying the stuff we're developing as front-runners, where does it leave us? Is it really economically the way to go? And of course, if you look at a sectoral level, if you would put, and would put the burden solely onto the power sector, as I've seen in some scenarios, that's changing right now, but it's always important what single studies are doing. But if you would use, for example, BECCS only in the power sector and would reach very high numbers there, then of course you would shift burdens among the sectors, and I will show you just an example. So we shouldn't fall into single studies syndrome. We never should, but sometimes policymakers do because they see one studies. Like many NGOs have seen Detlef's study and saying, "Oh wow, we can do without CDR now because science says so." I guess they haven't really read it. And here's another one, and you can see distributional effects among sectors of applying cost-effective BECCS, a study published in Climate Policy by very respected scholars, and they use only a minus 80% target for the EU, and they use the numbers from the EU Commission's energy roadmap, and here you have the sectors, and there you have the ranges of emissions reductions, and then they apply BECCS, and they land at minus 152%, even under a overall minus 80% target. And you see what happens to all the other sectors. Transport goes down considerably, buildings 50 percentage points, industry not so much. So if you show that to the, let's say, Federation of German Industries, they would say, well, it looks crazy, but maybe there's something in it for these sectors. While the power sector people would say, well, these modelers must be out of their minds. So on paper, it could look like easing your problems if you are in certain sectors, but of course that depends on the technology. That also depends on the assumption that the power sector would have the responsibility. You could also say, yeah, maybe we could do it in the power sector, but other sectors would have to pay for that. You could also argue, well, if we really do electrification of transport, then is the transport sector so much different from the power sector in the future? But people will look at that numbers, will look at potential flexibilities if you bring that new feature into policymaking. So what are the possible routes for CDR in the European Union? As you might know, the regulatory setup for the next decade is almost completed. That's a very interesting feature of EU policymaking, that you decide these things well in advance. So we already have the rules for the European emissions trading system beginning from 2021. Renewables, the negotiations are closing. LULUCF, we already have closed non-ETS emissions as well. And CDR has not been considered. So you might think, okay, until 2030, nothing is going to happen. But I would say there are new windows of opportunity emerging. Globally, if you perceive yourself as being one of the major actors in the international climate policy arena, you can never ignore what's happening on a global level. So you have the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, and many of you might have looked into it as expert reviewers or might have seen the SPM that has been leaked some weeks ago. You can easily see negative emissions will be a major factor in that report, and not only in the report, but I think also in the communication, because many researchers are fed up with the reluctance or the omission on the side of policymakers regarding negative emissions. So the EU somehow would have to react to that. And the Commission, other than national governments, is not elected by a parliament, is not dependent on a parliament. I would say these are it's the most evidence-based executive we know of, and especially the people in DG Climate Action, and they will try to deal with that. And they also have to find an answer, what will be the EU's reaction to the 1.5 degrees target, because the EU has been part of the so-called high ambition coalition in Paris. They supported 1.5, and they supported having the IPCC report, and come October it will be about consequences. And there's no appetite in the European Union for stricter mitigation targets by 2030. The UNFCCC facilitative dialogue, I, for a reason, chose facilitative because Poland already announced they will change Talanoa back to facilitative when they are responsible for the next COP. So talking about the future, some countries might bring in negative emissions. That remains to be seen. On the EU level, the Commission will come up with a long-term climate strategy in the first quarter of 2019. And there has been a lot of confusion about that, because the Commissioner himself tries to tell people that the EU will have a net zero emissions target. I've seen many articles right now, or in the last week, and it will be a net zero emissions target by 2050. I would bet it will not be. It's only a Commission document that will feed into considerations among member states what to deliver under the UNFCCC, where they have to submit a low greenhouse gas plan, a mid-century plan. It looks like the EU will go for a net zero in the second half of the century target, because they signed it under the Paris Agreement anyway. You should know that the member states are in charge to decide on overarching climate targets, and they have to do that by consensus. So always try to think about what Poland and Hungary might want to, or might be, where we might be able to push them. But nevertheless, bringing in net zero as the next target, whatever the target year would be, I think is progress, because then you can talk about CDR for residual emissions. So the next target will be net zero. We don't know when it will be decided and which what year, and maybe we will stick to in the second half of the century frame, but let's wait and see. So there are three possible ways, and they could be combined, that the Commission will lead the way. There are signs that negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal will be part of the new long-term climate strategy by the Commission. That does not mean it will be part of what the member states say they would want to do. And I think EU-level research funding will increase. But the interesting question will be, is it about the intention to deploy or the conceptual use or both? Because actors might have different reasons to do that. Member states leading the way. I think what we will see in countries like Sweden and others, maybe the UK, that's now thinking about a net zero target, maybe in France, thinking about a carbon neutrality target. CDR has to be part of the options to solving that puzzle, and because the numbers are not that high, it might be easier to talk about the need for CDR for residual emissions, although it will be a contested political category what residual emissions are, because then every sector might raise its hand and say, well, I'm residual emissions too, yeah, like in the end of the life of Brian, where everybody says, I'm Brian too. Everybody wants to have residual emissions, but I think we have to go through that phase. You could even think of, it's just speculative, appeasing Central and Eastern European member states with money for BECCS, say, well, a route to commercialization could be biomass co-firing, so maybe you just start with that. But if you look at the current Polish government, if you don't believe that climate change really is a problem, you wouldn't even want to have money for BECCS, and maybe it would not fare very well for the reputation of that technology. And then beyond the political sphere, early markets for, I guess, small-scale CDR could emerge, maybe depending on some decisions under the Paris Agreement for a new market mechanism. There will be, you see that already in the UK. Now the government is proposing to think about net zero, and then the mayor of London 2 weeks later says, well, we're going to be net zero too, and maybe earlier. So you might see competition for, we want to be a carbon neutral city by a certain year, and how are we going to do that, and look for options. So coming to the conclusion, I think we will see blurring boundaries between the LULUCF part of climate policy and CDR. It's the most likely part to integrate negative emissions into the policy paradigm, because simply framing CDR as enhancing things and not talking about, is it natural things, is it engineered things, you just refer to Article 4 of the Paris Agreement and have some kind of constructive ambiguity that allows the part of the environmentalists to say, well, yeah, we're going to have to do it, we acknowledge that, but we have to do it in a sensible way. And the other side of the spectrum to say, well, it's not geoengineering, we're already doing it, let's work together. Then conceptually assuming CDR and future EU member state and sectoral trajectories might prove more attractive and problematic than actually deploying CDR. It is a source of political flexibility. It can be used for target and trajectory gaming, but I would say it cannot be avoided. That's how policymaking works. You put it on the table and actors will think, oh wow, what can I do with that? And we might see very questionable intentions to think about CDR, but these intentions don't dictate the results. And that also goes the other way around. You can start with good intentions and the results can be questionable. I think we just have to live with that. And my proposal would be to focus on EU net zero targets, member state net zero targets, as a preferable way to introduce what I would call limited CDR, not talking about what we have to do until the end of the century, but looking at what will we have to do to tackle residual emissions, have still a focus on conventional mitigation, and learn something about doing CDR along the way, and then maybe plan for more later in the century. Thank you very much.